"We don't have room for you, Mom. Maybe it's time you looked into one of those senior facilities," my son David said as he blocked the doorway of the $1 million home I'd helped him buy. When I reminded him that I'd sold my house to make his dream mansion possible, his wife Amanda just shrugged and said, "That was your choice, not our responsibility." That night, sitting alone in a motel room while my clothes hung drying in the bathroom, I made 3 phone calls that would change everything. Within 6 weeks, David was on his knees begging me not to foreclose on his dream house. But by then, I owned his mortgage, controlled his business partnership, and held the keys to his children's college funds. Now Amanda wishes she'd never heard the words senior facility. David regrets choosing his wife's comfort over his mother's dignity. But me? I've never felt more powerful, and I've never slept better at night. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments. Have you ever had family members treat you like a burden when you needed them most? Share your story below, because today you're going to learn that sometimes the people who throw you away are about to discover exactly how much they needed what they just lost. This story is about the Tuesday when I learned that 35 years of sacrifice and unconditional love meant nothing when my presence became inconvenient for my son's new lifestyle. When I discovered that the child I'd raised alone after his father abandoned us had married a woman who saw me as nothing more than an embarrassing reminder of his humble beginnings. My name is Margaret Sullivan, and for the past 2 years, I'd been living in what my son David called the temporary guest arrangement in his sprawling home in Riverside Estates, an exclusive gated community about 15 miles outside of Charleston. The arrangement had seemed like a blessing when David first suggested it after my mild heart attack. I could recover in comfort while being close to my grandchildren, 8-year-old Emma and 10-year-old Michael, and they could have their grandmother nearby during what the doctors warned could be uncertain years ahead. What I didn't realize was that temporary guest arrangement actually meant charity case that will tolerate until it becomes socially awkward. What I didn't understand was that Amanda, David's wife of 12 years, had been counting the days until she could convince David that his mother had overstayed her welcome in their perfect suburban paradise. Let me tell you about the life I built before I became the unwanted guest in the home I'd helped create. I was born Margaret Catherine O'Brien in 1953, the daughter of Irish immigrants who believed that hard work and education were the only ways to build something meaningful in America. My father Patrick worked double shifts at the Charleston shipyard, while my mother Catherine cleaned houses for wealthy families in the historic district, saving every penny they could for my future. I met David's father, James Sullivan, when I was 22 and working as a bookkeeper for a small construction company downtown. James was 25, a charming electrician with dreams of starting his own contracting business and promises of building a life together that would honor both our families' sacrifices. We married in a simple ceremony at St. Patrick's Cathedral, with my parents' blessing and hopes for grandchildren who would grow up with opportunities we'd never had. For 3 years, James and I worked toward those dreams. He took on every electrical job he could find while I managed the books for his growing client base, and worked part-time at Henderson & Associates, a small accounting firm that handled books for local businesses. We lived in a modest apartment near the old market, saving money for the house we planned to buy and the children we hoped to have. David was born on a cold February morning in 1979, after we'd been trying for children for 2 years. When I held him for the first time, seeing James's dark hair and my own stubborn chin, I thought I understood what all the struggle had been for. He was perfect, healthy, alert, with a cry that announced his determination to make his presence known to the world. For the first 4 years of David's life, we were the kind of family that people envied. James's electrical business was growing steadily. I'd been promoted to senior bookkeeper at Henderson & Associates, and David was the kind of bright, curious child who made strangers smile when they watched him explore everything around him with fearless enthusiasm. But James had inherited more than just his father's work ethic. He'd also inherited his father's restless spirit and his grandfather's tendency to disappear when responsibilities became overwhelming. When David was 4 years old, James announced that he'd met someone else, someone who understood his need for freedom better than a wife and child ever could. He left on a Thursday morning in March, taking his tools, his truck, and every dollar from our joint savings account. He left behind a 4-year-old boy who kept asking when Daddy was coming home, a mortgage on the small house we'd finally managed to buy, and a woman who had to figure out how to rebuild a life that had been shattered. Without warning, the abandonment was devastating, but I didn't have the luxury of falling apart. David needed stability, needed to believe that the world was still safe and predictable, even though half of his foundation had disappeared overnight. I took on extra clients at Henderson & Associates, started doing freelance bookkeeping for small businesses in the evenings, and found a neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, who could watch David after school while I worked. For 15 years, I was both mother and father to David. I attended every parent-teacher conference, every baseball game, every school play. I helped with homework, taught him to drive, and worked overtime to save money for his college education. When he was accepted to the University of South Carolina with a partial scholarship, I took out loans to cover the remaining costs, telling myself that investing in David's future was the most important thing I could do with my life. David thrived. In college, studying business administration with a focus on real estate development, he was everything I'd hoped he would become: ambitious, intelligent, determined to build the kind of success that would honor all the sacrifices that had made his opportunities possible. When he graduated summa cum laude and immediately landed a position with Coastal Development Corporation, one of Charleston's most prestigious real estate firms, I was proud enough to burst. During his senior year, David had met Amanda Richardson, a beautiful psychology major from a wealthy Charleston family that owned a chain of upscale boutiques throughout the Southeast. Amanda was everything I wasn't: sophisticated, well-connected, from the kind of old Southern money that opened doors before you even had to knock. When David brought her home for the first time, I was thrilled that my son had found someone who clearly adored him and who came from the kind of stable family background that would give him the security he'd missed during his childhood. The wedding was held at the prestigious Magnolia Plantation, with 300 guests, flowers that cost more than I'd spent on my entire wedding to James, and a reception that was featured in Charleston society magazines. I was proud to be the mother of the groom, grateful that David had found love with someone who would support his ambitions and help him build the kind of life he deserved. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to certain details. Amanda's family filled 2/3 of the church, while David's side had me, 3 college friends, 2 co-workers from Coastal Development, and several empty pews that reminded everyone present that David came from more modest circumstances than his bride. During the reception, Amanda's mother, Helen, introduced me to people as David's mother, the bookkeeper, while she introduced her own family and friends with detailed descriptions of their social connections and business achievements. I should have noticed that when Amanda talked about their future plans, those plans never included considerations for aging parents or extended family obligations. I should have realized that when Amanda's friends discussed their own family situations, they talked about parents who lived in their own homes, managed their own affairs, and maintained their independence well into their golden years. But I was happy for David, grateful that he'd found love, and optimistic that Amanda would come to appreciate the close relationship David and I had always shared. I thought time and familiarity would help Amanda understand that I wasn't competing with her for David's affection. I was simply a mother who wanted to remain part of her son's life in whatever way felt comfortable for his new family. The first few years of their marriage seemed to confirm my optimism. Amanda was polite and friendly, including me in holiday celebrations and birthday parties. When Emma was born, Amanda seemed genuinely grateful for my help during those difficult first months. when sleep deprivation and new parent anxiety made every day feel like an endurance test. I spent countless hours rocking Emma when she had colic, preparing meals for the exhausted new parents, and providing the kind of practical support that made new parenthood manageable. When Michael arrived 2 years later, the pattern repeated. I was the reliable grandmother who could be counted on for emergency babysitting, meal preparation, and the kind of hands-on help that allowed Amanda to maintain her part-time work as a family counselor while adjusting to life with 2 young children. Amanda praised my assistance to her friends, calling me a godsend and the kind of mother-in-law every woman dreams of having. But I began to notice that the praise was always delivered in my absence, and that Amanda's appreciation seemed to focus more on my usefulness than on my relationship with David or my bond with the children. Still, I was content with my role as the helpful grandmother who lived in my own small house just 20 minutes away from David's growing family. My mortgage had been paid off years earlier. I had a comfortable retirement from my decades of work in bookkeeping, and I enjoyed the balance between independence and family involvement that allowed me to be present for important moments without overwhelming the young family with unwanted advice or interference. Everything changed when I had my heart attack 2 years ago. I was 68, had always been healthy, and the chest pains that sent me to the emergency room on a quiet Tuesday. Afternoon came without warning. The doctors said it was a mild attack, probably brought on by years of stress and a genetic predisposition I'd inherited from my father's side of the family. With proper medication, diet changes, and lifestyle modifications, they assured me I could expect many more years of good health. But the heart attack had shaken both David and me in ways that went beyond medical concerns. Suddenly, the reality of my aging and mortality became impossible to ignore. David became anxious about me living alone, worried about what might happen if I had another episode with no one nearby to help. Amanda expressed concern about my ability to maintain my house and manage my affairs independently. When David suggested that I sell my house and move into their spacious home in Riverside Estates, it seemed like a natural solution to everyone's concerns. The house was certainly large enough, a 6-bedroom colonial with a guest wing that included its own sitting room, bedroom, and bathroom. I could maintain my privacy while being close enough that David wouldn't worry about my health and safety. "It'll be perfect, Mom," David had said as he showed me through the guest wing that would become my new home. "You'll have your own space, but we'll have peace of mind knowing you're nearby if anything happens. And Emma and Michael will love having their grandmother so close." What David didn't mention was that peace of mind would gradually transform into assumptions about my availability for childcare, household management, and whatever other responsibilities Amanda preferred not to handle herself. What Amanda didn't mention was that she'd begun to see the guest wing less as my home and more as convenient on-site housing for the unpaid domestic help. The sale of my house had netted $180,000 after paying off the remaining small mortgage and covering real estate fees. Instead of keeping that money for my own future needs, I'd given $120,000 to David as what I called an early inheritance to help with their own mortgage and home improvements. The remaining $60,000 I'd kept in a savings account for emergencies and personal expenses. At the time, giving David the majority of my house sale proceeds had seemed like a generous way to help secure his family's financial future while ensuring that I wouldn't be seen as a financial burden on their household. David had been grateful, Amanda had been gracious, and I'd felt good about contributing to the beautiful home where I would spend my remaining years surrounded by family. What I didn't understand was that my financial contribution would eventually be reframed as my choice, rather than acknowledged as the generous gift that had made their lifestyle possible. What I didn't anticipate was that Amanda would begin to see my presence in their home as an obligation they'd inherited, rather than a blessing they'd chosen. For the first year after moving in, the arrangement worked exactly as David had promised. I maintained my independence while being available to help with Emma and Michael when needed. I contributed to household expenses without being asked, prepared family meals several times a week, and provided the kind of grandparent presence that enriched the children's daily lives. But somewhere during the second year, my helpfulness transformed from appreciated contribution to expected service. The thank yous became less frequent. The inclusion in family decision-making became rare. The assumption that I would be available whenever needed became absolute, while the consideration for my own needs and preferences became non-existent. Amanda began making social plans that excluded me while expecting me to provide childcare for the events I wasn't invited to attend. David started working longer hours and traveling more frequently, leaving me to manage household responsibilities that had once been shared among all the adults in the house. Most telling of all, Amanda began making comments about eventually, and when the time comes, that suggested she was already planning for my departure from their home. Comments about friends whose parents lived in lovely senior communities where they could socialize with people their own age. Observations about how difficult it was for families to manage aging parents while maintaining their own independence and privacy. I told myself that these comments were just Amanda thinking out loud about future possibilities, normal concerns that any daughter-in-law might have about long-term living arrangements. I told myself that the increasing expectations and decreasing appreciation were temporary adjustments that would improve once everyone settled into a comfortable routine. I told myself a lot of things that turned out to be lies designed to avoid confronting the truth about my situation. The truth was that I'd become the live-in help, expected to provide services without receiving consideration. The truth was that Amanda had never seen me as family, but rather as an obstacle to the lifestyle she wanted to maintain. The truth was that David, the son I'd raised alone and supported through every challenge of his youth, had gradually adopted his wife's view of me as a convenience rather than a person worthy of respect and consideration. But I didn't fully understand these truths until the Tuesday that changed everything. The Tuesday when 2 years of increasing resentment and social awkwardness finally reached the breaking point that Amanda had been engineering since the day I'd moved into what she'd never really considered my home. The Tuesday when my son looked me in the eye and told me there wasn't room for me in the house I'd helped him buy, in the life I'd helped him build, in the family I'd sacrificed everything to support. The Tuesday when I finally understood that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are actually the ones who see you as the most disposable. The morning that would transform me from Margaret the grateful mother to Margaret the force to be reckoned with started with what I thought was a routine conversation about Emma's upcoming birthday party. Amanda had been planning an elaborate celebration for our 8-year-old granddaughter, a princess-themed party with professional decorators, a bounce house, and 25 little guests who would require careful supervision and entertainment. Margaret, Amanda said as I was finishing breakfast in the main kitchen, I wanted to talk to you about Emma's party this weekend. I looked up from my coffee, pleased to be included in the planning for what I knew was an important milestone for Emma. Of course, what can I do to help? Amanda's expression was carefully neutral, the kind of composed face she used when she was about to say something she knew would be unwelcome. Well, the thing is, several of the parents will be staying for the party and we're expecting some of David's colleagues from Coastal Development. It's really more of a networking opportunity than a typical children's birthday party. I waited, sensing that there was more coming and that whatever Amanda was building up to, I wasn't going to like it. The guest list has gotten quite large, and with the entertainment and catering setup, the house is going to be very crowded, Amanda continued, her tone taking on the carefully reasonable quality she used when she was trying to make unreasonable requests sound logical. I see, I said, though I didn't really see where this conversation was heading. So I was thinking, Amanda said, avoiding direct eye contact, that it might be better if you spent the day elsewhere. Maybe visit that nice library downtown, or take yourself to lunch and a movie. Something fun for you while we handle the party. Chaos. The casual dismissal hit me like a physical blow, I was being asked to leave my own home during my granddaughter's birthday party because my presence would somehow interfere with Amanda's social and professional networking opportunities. Amanda, I said carefully, this is Emma's birthday. I'm her grandmother. Why would I need to be somewhere else during her celebration? Amanda shifted uncomfortably, clearly having hoped that I would simply accept the exclusion without requiring detailed justification. It's not that we don't want you here, she said, though her tone suggested exactly the opposite. It's just that the dynamics will be quite sophisticated, and some of the conversation topics might not be, well, you know how these business social situations can be. Business social situations. Amanda was suggesting that I wasn't sophisticated enough to participate in adult conversation at my own granddaughter's birthday party. What exactly are you concerned about? I asked, my voice remaining calm despite the anger building in my chest. Oh, you know, Amanda said with a dismissive wave. Talk about private schools, vacation homes, investment strategies, the kind of topics that come up when you put successful professionals in a room together. I just thought you might be more comfortable doing your own thing, rather than trying to keep up with conversations that aren't really relevant to your lifestyle. Your lifestyle. As if my decades of work experience, my successful management of household finances, my years of supporting David's education and career development somehow made me incapable of participating in adult conversation about topics I'd been dealing with longer than most of Amanda's friends had been alive. But what stung even more than the intellectual dismissal was the underlying message. That my presence at family events was now conditional on whether Amanda found it convenient and socially appropriate. Amanda, I said, setting down my coffee cup with deliberate care. I think there's been a misunderstanding. This is my home, and Emma is my granddaughter. I won't be leaving during her birthday party. Amanda's carefully composed expression cracked slightly, revealing the irritation she'd been working to conceal. Margaret, I really think you're not understanding the situation here, she said, her voice taking on an edge that I'd never heard, directed at me before. This party is important for David's career. These people are potential clients and business partners. The impression we make could affect our family's future. Our family's future. Amanda was making it clear that when she said our family, she didn't include me. I understand perfectly, I said, standing up from the breakfast table. I understand that you're asking me to leave my home during my granddaughter's birthday party because you're embarrassed by my presence in front of people you want to impress. That's not what I'm saying, Amanda protested, but her tone lacked conviction. That's exactly what you're saying, I replied. And the answer is no. I won't be leaving and I won't be hiding in my room like some shameful family secret. If you're uncomfortable with my presence at Emma's birthday party, perhaps you should consider whether the problem is with me or with your own priorities. Amanda's face flushed with anger, and for a moment I saw past the carefully maintained facade of politeness to the resentment that had been building for months. Fine, she said coldly, but don't expect me to manage the social awkwardness when people start asking uncomfortable questions about our living situation. Uncomfortable questions about our living situation. Amanda was already anticipating explaining to her friends why her mother-in-law lived in their house, as if my presence was something that required justification rather than celebration. That conversation had taken place on Monday morning. By Tuesday evening, I would understand that Amanda's desire to exclude me from Emma's birthday party wasn't an isolated incident. It was the opening move in a campaign to remove me from their lives entirely. I had no idea that by Wednesday morning, I would be sitting in a motel room, making phone calls that would change everything about the power dynamics in our family relationship. I had no idea that the woman who'd been dismissed as too unsophisticated for a children's birthday party was about to demonstrate exactly how sophisticated someone could be when they finally decided to stop being grateful for scraps and start demanding the respect they'd earned. The conversation about Emma's birthday party had left me unsettled in ways I couldn't immediately articulate. As I retreated to my room in the guest wing, I found myself thinking about the early days of David and Amanda's marriage, when inclusion in family celebrations had been automatic rather than conditional, when my presence had been welcomed rather than merely tolerated. I remembered the first Christmas after they'd moved into the Riverside Estates house, 3 years before my heart attack changed everything. Amanda had insisted that I stay over for the entire holiday weekend, saying that Christmas morning wouldn't be the same without grandparents present to watch Emma and Michael open their presents. She'd prepared a beautiful guest room for me, complete with fresh flowers and my favorite lavender soap, and had included me in every aspect of the holiday planning. "Margaret, what do you think about serving brunch instead of a formal dinner?" Amanda had asked, genuinely interested in my opinion. "I know you have more experience entertaining than I do, and I want everything to be perfect for the children's first Christmas in the new house." Back then, Amanda had treated my decades of homemaking experience as valuable knowledge rather than outdated information. She'd asked for my recipes, my advice on holiday traditions, my suggestions for making the house feel warm and welcoming. We'd spent hours together preparing meals, decorating the tree, and wrapping presents, talking like the friends I'd hoped we might become. David had been different then, too. More attentive to my comfort, more interested in my opinions, more aware of including me in conversations and decision-making. He'd ask about my health, not just out of obligation, but because he genuinely wanted to know how I was feeling. He'd share stories about his work challenges, seeking the kind of guidance that suggested he still valued the wisdom I'd gained during my years of supporting his education and early career. "Mom, I don't know what I would have done without you," he'd said that Christmas morning, watching Emma and Michael play with their new toys while Amanda and I cleaned up the wrapping paper chaos. Looking around this house, seeing how happy the kids are, knowing that we're building something solid, none of this would have been possible without everything you sacrificed to get me here. Those words had meant everything to me, not just because they acknowledged the financial and emotional investment I'd made in David's success, but because they suggested that my contributions were seen as foundational rather than incidental to the family's happiness. But as I sat in my room on that Tuesday evening, trying to process Amanda's casual dismissal of my place at Emma's birthday party, I realized that those early expressions of gratitude and inclusion had gradually been replaced by assumptions and obligations. Somewhere along the way, my helpfulness had transformed from a gift to be appreciated into a service to be expected. The shift had been so gradual that I'd barely noticed it happening. It started with small things, Amanda assuming I'd be available for last-minute babysitting without asking if I had other plans. David expecting me to handle household tasks during his business trips without discussing whether I was comfortable with the additional responsibilities. Both of them making social plans that excluded me while taking for granted that I'd be available to manage whatever childcare or household needs arose during their absences. The pattern had become clear during David's business trip to Atlanta 6 months earlier. He'd been gone for a week, attending a real estate development conference that Amanda had described as crucial for his career advancement. Instead of hiring a babysitter or adjusting her own schedule to accommodate his absence, Amanda had simply announced that I'd be helping out more than usual while David was away. What helping out more than usual actually meant was taking complete responsibility for Emma and Michael's daily routines, while Amanda maintained her normal schedule of yoga classes, book club meetings, and lunch dates with friends. I'd handled school pickups and drop-offs, prepared all meals, supervised homework, managed bedtime routines, and dealt with Michael's stomach flu that developed midweek. When Amanda went out for dinner with friends on Thursday evening of that week, leaving me alone with both children, including a sick 10-year-old, I'd begun to understand that my role in the household had evolved beyond helpful grandmother into unpaid domestic staff. "It's just for a few hours," Amanda had said as she left, for her dinner engagement, dressed in an outfit that had probably cost more than I'd spent on clothing in the past year. "You're so good with the kids when they're not feeling well, I'd probably just stress them out by hovering." But what bothered me wasn't the few hours of childcare, it was Amanda's assumption that her social obligations took priority over my own potential plans, and her casual dismissal of my time as infinitely available whenever her convenience required it. When David returned from Atlanta, full of enthusiasm about new business contacts and potential development projects, neither he nor Amanda had acknowledged the week of intensive childcare I'd provided. There had been no thank you, no acknowledgement of the disruption to my own routine, no appreciation for the fact that I'd managed a household crisis while they pursued their respective priorities. Instead, David had launched into detailed stories about the conference, the impressive professionals he'd met, and the exclusive social events he'd attended. Amanda had been appropriately interested and supportive, asking intelligent questions about his new contacts and expressing enthusiasm about the business opportunities he was exploring. I'd listened to their conversation from the kitchen, where I was preparing dinner and thinking about how differently this homecoming might have unfolded if I'd been David's wife rather than his mother. A wife's contributions during her husband's absence would have been acknowledged and appreciated. A wife's sacrifice of her own social activities would have been recognized and reciprocated. But a mother's contributions, apparently, were simply expected. The week of intensive childcare, household management, and crisis resolution was treated as the natural order of things, rather than a significant favor that deserved recognition and gratitude. That night, as I'd lain in bed listening to David and Amanda discuss their plans for the weekend, plans that included social engagements I hadn't been invited to and wouldn't be informed about until they needed childcare coverage, I'd first begun to wonder whether my presence in their home was valued for who I was, or simply useful for what I could provide. But it was the incident with Amanda's mother, Helen Richardson, that had really opened my eyes to how my status in the family had changed over the 2 years I'd been living in Riverside Estates. Helen Richardson was old Charleston money, the kind of woman who traced her family's presence in the city back to before the Civil War, and who maintained membership in social organizations that most people couldn't even pronounce correctly. She lived in a magnificent antebellum mansion in the historic district, entertained regularly, and wielded the kind of social influence that could make or break a young family's acceptance into Charleston's elite circles. Helen had always been polite to me, but with the kind of distant courtesy that suggested she saw me as a necessary but temporary part of Amanda's life, rather than a permanent fixture in the family structure. During the early years of David and Amanda's marriage, this polite distance had felt appropriate. We were from different backgrounds, different generations, different social circles, and it made sense that our interactions would be pleasant but limited. But 6 months ago, during a family dinner at Helen's house to celebrate Amanda's birthday, I'd overheard a conversation that revealed exactly how Helen, and by extension, Amanda, really viewed my living situation. The dinner had been elegant, as all of Helen's entertainments were. 12 guests seated around a table that had probably been in the Richardson family for generations, served food prepared by Helen's longtime housekeeper, Rosa, and engaged in the kind of sophisticated conversation that Amanda had worried I wouldn't be able to follow during Emma's upcoming birthday party. I'd been seated next to Dr. William Thornton, a retired physician who'd been a friend of Helen's late husband, and we'd been having a pleasant conversation about the changes we'd witnessed in Charleston over the decades. Dr. Thornton was interested, in my perspective, as someone who'd lived in the city for my entire adult life, and we'd discovered shared memories of local businesses, community events, and neighborhood transformations. It's fascinating to hear from someone who's seen the city evolve from a working person's perspective, Dr. Thornton had said. So often, our social circle only includes people who've experienced Charleston from the same privileged vantage point. Your insights about how development has affected ordinary families are quite enlightening. I'd been pleased by his genuine interest and had been sharing some observations about how gentrification had displaced longtime residents when I'd happened to overhear Helen's conversation with another guest, Mrs. Caroline Whitmore, at the other end of the table. Amanda's handling the situation with remarkable grace. Helen was saying in the kind of lowered voice that suggested confidential information was being shared. It's not easy having an aging parent. Move in, especially when there are such significant differences in background and social expectations. Mrs. Whitmore had nodded sympathetically. How long has the arrangement been going on? These things can be quite challenging for young families trying to establish their own social position. Nearly 2 years now, Helen had replied. Amanda's been wonderful about including Margaret in family activities, but of course, there are certain social situations where it's simply not appropriate. You understand, the generational gap, the different comfort levels with our social circle's expectations and conversation topics. Different comfort levels. Helen was suggesting that I wasn't sophisticated enough to participate in their social activities, that my presence would somehow compromise Amanda's standing in Charleston's elite circles. Has Amanda considered looking into some of the lovely senior communities around town? Mrs. Whitmore had asked. I know several families who've found that arrangement works much better for everyone involved. The older generation gets appropriate socialization and care, while the younger generation maintains the independence necessary for career and social advancement. We've discussed it, Helen had said, glancing briefly in my direction before lowering her voice even further. But you know how these family obligations can be complicated. David feels responsible, and Margaret contributed financially to their home purchase. So there are considerations beyond just what might be most comfortable for everyone. Financial contributions that created obligations. Helen was framing my help with their mortgage as a burden that David and Amanda were carrying, rather than a generous gift that had made their lifestyle possible. Still, Mrs. Whitmore had continued, at some point, family harmony has to take priority. These multi-generational living situations rarely work out long-term, especially when there are social and cultural differences that create awkwardness in professional or social contexts. I'd sat there, still engaged in conversation with Dr. Thornton, while processing the devastating realization that my living situation was seen as a temporary obligation rather than a permanent family arrangement. That my presence was viewed as an impediment to Amanda's social advancement rather than a valuable addition to their family structure. Most painful of all was the understanding that Amanda had apparently been discussing my eventual relocation with her mother for some time, planning for my departure rather than finding ways to make my inclusion more comfortable for everyone involved. Dr. Thornton had noticed my distraction and had asked if I was feeling well. I'd managed to redirect our conversation and finish the evening without revealing my emotional state, but the damage had been done. I'd heard exactly what Amanda and her family really thought about my place in their lives, and it wasn't what David had promised when he'd convinced me to sell my house and move into their guest wing. The drive home from Helen's house that night had been quiet, with Amanda chatting about the dinner party's success, while David responded with appropriate enthusiasm about the business contacts he'd made and the social connections that might prove useful for his career advancement. I'd sat in the back seat, watching the familiar streets of Charleston pass by, and realized that I'd been living in a fantasy. The fantasy that family meant inclusion, that generosity created gratitude, that love translated into consideration and respect. The reality was that I'd become an inconvenience that was tolerated because removing me would be socially awkward and potentially financially complicated. My presence in their home wasn't valued. It was endured. But even after overhearing Helen's conversation, even after recognizing the pattern of increasing expectations and decreasing appreciation, I'd continued to tell myself that the situation could be managed. That if I just remained useful enough, unobtrusive enough, grateful enough for whatever consideration I received, Amanda and David would continue to find room for me in their lives. I'd told myself that Amanda's social concerns were understandable, that Helen's perspectives were influenced by generational and class differences that didn't necessarily reflect how David and Amanda felt about me personally. I'd convinced myself that the overheard conversation was about managing social dynamics rather than planning my eventual displacement. But looking back now, I could see that every interaction since that dinner at Helen's house had been colored. by Amanda's growing urgency to resolve what she saw as the Margaret situation. Every comment about senior communities, every suggestion about activities I might enjoy with people my own age, every casual mention of friends whose parents lived independently had been part of a campaign to prepare me for my eventual departure. The birthday party exclusion had been Amanda's most direct attempt yet to demonstrate that my presence was incompatible with the social life she wanted to maintain. By asking me to leave during Emma's party, she was testing whether I would accept increasingly obvious signs that I wasn't welcome at family events. My refusal to be dismissed from my granddaughter's birthday party had apparently convinced Amanda that subtlety wasn't working. If I wouldn't take hints about voluntary relocation, she was going to have to take more direct action. What I didn't understand, as I sat in my room on Tuesday evening reflecting on all of these accumulated slights and dismissals, was that Amanda had already begun implementing the more direct approach. What I didn't know was that she'd been working on David for weeks, building a case for why my continued presence in their home was becoming untenable. What I couldn't have imagined was that by Wednesday morning, I would discover exactly how far Amanda was willing to go to reclaim what she saw as her rightful control over her own home and social life. I couldn't have predicted that the son who'd once called me indispensable would look me in the eye and tell me there wasn't room for me in the life I'd helped him build. But as I prepared for bed that Tuesday night, I did have a growing sense that something fundamental was about to change in our family dynamic. The tension had been building for months, and Amanda's willingness to openly exclude me from Emma's birthday party suggested that the careful politeness that had characterized our relationship was finally breaking down. I fell asleep thinking about the early days of David's childhood, when it had been just the two of us against the world. When he would climb into my bed during thunderstorms, seeking comfort from the mother who represented safety and unconditional love. When he would share his dreams about the life he wanted to build, always including me in those visions of future success and happiness. When I'm grown up and have my own house, David had told me when he was 8 years old, you're going to live with me forever, and we'll have a big garden where you can grow all your favorite flowers. I'd treasured that innocent promise, not because I expected him to honor it literally, but because it represented the kind of love that sees caring for family as a privilege rather than a burden. The kind of love that values inclusion over convenience, that prioritizes relationships over social appearances. But somewhere between that 8-year-old boy's promise and the 35-year-old man's reality, David had learned that love could be conditional. That family obligations could be renegotiated when they became inconvenient. That the mother who'd sacrificed everything for his success could be redefined as an obstacle to his continued advancement. Wednesday morning would teach me that sometimes the people who promise to love you forever are actually just making promises. They don't understand they'll want to break. Wednesday morning would show me that the son who'd once sought my protection from life's storms was now willing to throw me out into one. But Wednesday morning would also reveal something that neither David nor Amanda had anticipated, that the woman they saw as a helpless burden was actually a force they should never have underestimated. The morning began normally enough, with the routine I'd established over the 2 years of living in Riverside Estates. I woke at 6 a.m., made coffee in the small kitchenette of my guest wing, and spent an hour reading the Charleston Post and Courier while enjoying the quiet peace of early morning. This had always been my favorite time of day, the hour before the household stirred to life, when I could collect my thoughts and prepare for whatever demands the day might bring. By 7 a.m., I could hear movement in the main house as David and Amanda began their morning routines. Emma and Michael would be awake soon, requiring breakfast preparation, lunch packing, and the usual orchestration of getting 2 children ready for school. This had become my signal to join the family in the main kitchen, where I'd taken on the responsibility of managing the children's morning needs, while David and Amanda focused on their own professional preparations. But as I approached the kitchen, that Wednesday morning I could hear David and Amanda engaged in a conversation that was clearly not intended for my ears. Their voices were lowered, but the intensity suggested they were discussing something significant and potentially controversial. "Can't continue indefinitely," Amanda was saying as I paused in the hallway just outside the kitchen entrance. "It's been 2 years, David. 2 years of having no privacy, no independence, no ability to live our lives the way we want to live them." "I know it's been an adjustment," David replied, his tone carrying the defensive quality he used when he knew Amanda was right but didn't want to admit it. "But Mom's health scare really affected her confidence. She's probably just afraid of living alone again." "Her health scare was 2 years ago," Amanda said, her voice sharp with frustration. "The doctors said she was fine. Her recovery was complete. There's no medical reason she needs to be living here, David. The only reason she's still here is because we've allowed her to become comfortable depending on us instead of rebuilding her independence, depending on them." Amanda was reframing my contribution to their household as dependency rather than acknowledging the financial help, childcare support, and domestic assistance I'd been providing. "But where would she go?" David asked, and I could hear genuine concern in his voice. "She sold her house to help us with our mortgage. She can't just start over at 70. "There are options," Amanda said, her tone taking on the patient quality she used when explaining something she considered obvious. "Lovely senior communities, assisted living facilities designed for people her age. Places where she could have her own space while having access to appropriate support and social activities." Appropriate support and social activities. Amanda was suggesting that my current social life, which revolved entirely around their family, was somehow inappropriate for someone my age. "I don't know, Amanda," David said slowly. "It feels wrong to ask her to leave when she helped make this house possible in the first place." "David, we need to think about our children's future," Amanda said, her voice becoming more urgent. "Emma and Michael need to see their parents as independent adults who manage their own household. They need to understand that successful families don't operate as extended care facilities for aging relatives." Extended care facilities. Amanda was describing my presence in their home as if I were an invalid requiring nursing assistance rather than a healthy, capable woman who'd been contributing to their household management. "Besides," Amanda continued, "your mother's living situation is starting to affect our social standing. Do you realize how many invitations we've had to decline because explaining Margaret's presence would be awkward? How many business opportunities you might be missing because we can't entertain the way successful couples in our position should be able to entertain?" Our position. Amanda was making it clear that she saw David's career advancement and their social status as incompatible with my continued presence in their home. "What are you suggesting?" David asked, though his tone suggested he already knew what Amanda was building toward. "I'm suggesting that we sit down with Margaret and help her understand that it's time for her to reclaim her independence," Amanda said. "That we present her with some lovely options for senior living that would give her the appropriate social environment while allowing our family to function normally." Function normally. Amanda was suggesting that our current family structure was abnormal rather than simply different from what she preferred. "And if she doesn't want to move?" David asked. There was a pause, and when Amanda spoke again, her voice carried a steely determination that I'd never heard directed toward family matters. "Then we help her understand that her choice is between moving voluntarily or making this situation uncomfortable for everyone involved," she said. "David, we're talking about the rest of our lives, your career, our children's futures, our ability to build the kind of social and professional network that will sustain this family's success. Are you willing to sacrifice all of that to avoid having one difficult conversation with your mother?" One difficult conversation. Amanda was reducing 2 years of my life, my financial contribution to their success, and my role in their children's daily care to a single inconvenient discussion that was standing between them and their ideal lifestyle. I'd heard enough. I retreated quietly to my room, my mind reeling from the revelation that David and Amanda had been planning my displacement while I'd been focusing on Emma's birthday party arrangements and my concern about Amanda's casual dismissal of my place. at family celebrations. The conversation I'd overheard made everything clear. This wasn't about social awkwardness or temporary adjustment difficulties. This was about Amanda's fundamental belief that my presence in their home was incompatible with the life she wanted to live, and David's apparent willingness to prioritize his wife's preferences over his mother's security and dignity. For the next hour, I sat in my room, processing the implications of what I'd learned. The exclusion from Emma's birthday party hadn't been an isolated incident. It had been part of a larger campaign to demonstrate that I didn't belong in their social circle. The comments about senior communities hadn't been casual observations. They had been strategic preparations for the conversation Amanda was planning to initiate. Most devastating of all was the realization that David, the son I'd raised alone and supported through every challenge of his youth, was actively participating in planning my removal from the family I'd helped him build. At 8:30 a.m., I heard Emma and Michael calling for their grandmother from the main kitchen. They'd discovered that I wasn't there to help with breakfast preparation, and were looking for me with the casual expectation that had characterized our morning routines for the past 2 years. "Where's Grandma Margaret?" Emma was asking. "I need help finding my math homework, and she always knows where everything is." "I can't find my baseball glove," Michael added. "Grandma Margaret said she'd help me look for it this morning." I listened to their voices, sweet, trusting, completely unaware that their parents were planning to remove me from their daily lives. Emma and Michael had never known insecurity about their grandmother's presence. I'd been a constant in their lives since they were small children, and the idea that I might not always be available to help with math homework and missing baseball gloves had never occurred to them. "Your grandmother is probably just sleeping in," I heard Amanda say, her tone carrying forced cheerfulness. "Let's see if we can manage breakfast on our own this morning. Sleeping in." Amanda was already beginning the process of explaining my absence, preparing the children for a reality where their grandmother wasn't automatically available for daily support and assistance. I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of joining the family for breakfast and pretending I hadn't overheard their conversation, I would wait. I would let David and Amanda proceed with whatever plan they'd developed, and I would respond accordingly. What they didn't understand was that I'd spent decades managing crisis situations, making difficult decisions under pressure, and protecting my family's interests even when doing so required personal sacrifice. What they hadn't anticipated was that the woman they saw as a dependent burden was actually someone with considerable resources, extensive experience, and a comprehensive understanding of exactly how vulnerable their comfortable lifestyle really was. By evening, I would discover just how little room David thought there was for me in the life I'd helped him build. By tomorrow, I would begin showing him exactly how much room I was actually going to require. The overheard conversation between David and Amanda had shattered any remaining illusions I'd held about my place in their family. But as I sat in my room that Wednesday morning, I found myself thinking about how gradually this transformation had occurred. The shift from valued family member to unwanted burden hadn't happened overnight. It had been a slow erosion of respect and consideration that had been so subtle I'd barely noticed it happening until it was too late. I remembered the exact moment when David had first suggested I move into their home, 3 months after my heart attack when I was still recovering and adjusting to the reality of my own mortality. We'd been sitting in my old kitchen in the modest house I'd owned for 30 years, the house where I'd raised David alone and built a life worth living through careful planning and persistent effort. "Mom, I've been thinking," David had said, his voice carrying the careful tone he used when he was about to make a significant proposal. "This house is getting to be too much for you to manage alone, especially with your health concerns. What if you sold it and moved in with us? We have plenty of room, and Amanda and I would feel so much better knowing you were nearby if anything happened." At the time, his suggestion had seemed motivated by genuine love and concern. David had been attentive and worried during my recovery, calling daily to check on my progress and visiting frequently to ensure I was following my doctor's instructions. Amanda had been equally solicitous, bringing meals and offering to help, with household tasks that had become temporarily challenging during my recovery period. "The guest wing would be perfect for you," David had continued, his enthusiasm building as he described the arrangement. "You'd have your own space, a beautiful bedroom, sitting area, and private bathroom. But you'd be close enough that we could help if you needed anything, and Emma and Michael would love having their grandmother so nearby." The financial aspect of his proposal had seemed generous rather than exploitative. My house, while modest, was located in a neighborhood that had appreciated significantly over the years. The sale would net enough money to pay off my small remaining mortgage and provide a substantial sum that could contribute to David and Amanda's own financial security. "You could think of it as an early inheritance," David had suggested when I'd expressed concern about the money. "You've worked so hard your entire life, Mom. You deserve to spend your remaining years surrounded by family without worrying about house maintenance and financial pressure." Amanda had been equally encouraging about the arrangement, describing it as a blessing for their entire family. "The children would benefit so much from having you around more," she'd said during one of our conversations about the potential move. "Emma especially has been asking why her friends see their grandmothers more often than she sees you. And honestly, Margaret, I could use the wisdom and support of someone with your experience raising children." The way Amanda had framed my potential presence in their home as a source of wisdom and support rather than a burden to be managed had made the arrangement seem like a mutually beneficial opportunity rather than a charity case requiring their tolerance. Looking back now, I could see that Amanda's early enthusiasm about my moving in had been genuine, but for reasons I hadn't fully understood at the time. What I'd interpreted as appreciation for my potential contribution to their family life had actually been excitement about having access to live-in childcare and household assistance. Amanda had been pregnant with Michael when David first suggested the living arrangement, and the prospect of having an experienced mother and grandmother available during the challenging months of adjusting to 2 children had obviously appealed to her practical nature. What hadn't occurred to me was that Amanda's vision of my role in their household was fundamentally different from David's presentation of the arrangement. David had described the move as an opportunity for me to be supported and cared for during my transition into older age. Amanda had seen it as an opportunity to acquire domestic help and childcare assistance without the expense and complications of hiring outside services. The disconnect between these two visions hadn't become apparent until after I'd already sold. My house contributed the majority of the proceeds to their mortgage and established myself in the guest wing that I'd believed would be my permanent home. The first few months had seemed to confirm David's vision of the arrangement. I'd been treated as an honored family member whose presence enriched their daily lives. Amanda had genuinely sought my advice about child rearing, meal planning, and household management. David had included me in family decisions and had expressed regular gratitude for my presence and contributions. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the dynamic had begun to shift from appreciation to expectation. It started with small assumptions about my availability. Instead of asking if I could watch Emma while Amanda attended a doctor's appointment, Amanda began mentioning that she had an appointment and would be leaving Emma with me. Instead of checking whether I had plans before scheduling evening activities that required childcare, David and Amanda began assuming that I would be available whenever they needed me. The transition from requests to assumptions had been so gradual that I'd initially interpreted it as evidence of growing comfort and trust rather than warning signs of increasing exploitation. When Amanda stopped saying please and thank you for routine childcare assistance, I told myself it was because we'd become comfortable enough with each other that formal politeness was no longer necessary. When David stopped asking for my opinions about family decisions and began simply informing me about plans that had already been made, I convinced myself it was because he'd become confident in his own judgment, rather than because my input was no longer valued. The most insidious aspect of this gradual transformation was how slowly it had eroded my own sense of boundaries and self-advocacy. Because the changes happened incrementally, I'd found myself accepting treatment that I would have immediately rejected if it had been presented all at once. If Amanda had asked me on my first day in their home to provide full-time childcare, while she maintained her own social schedule without consideration for my own needs and interests, I would have recognized the arrangement as exploitative and would have refused to participate. But because the expectations had increased gradually over months and years, I'd found myself providing exactly that level of service while telling myself that I was being helpful rather than used. The pattern had become most apparent during Michael's infancy, when Amanda's needs for support had been greatest and my willingness to provide assistance had been most complete. Michael had been a difficult baby, colicky, prone to sleep disruption, requiring the kind of intensive care that left new parents exhausted and overwhelmed. During his first 6 months, I'd essentially functioned as a night nurse, taking responsibility for middle-of-the-night feeding so that Amanda could maintain enough rest to care for Emma during the day. "I don't know what I'd do without you," Amanda had said repeatedly during those exhausting months. "Having you here has made this so much more manageable than it would have been otherwise." At the time, I'd interpreted these expressions of gratitude as evidence that my presence was valued and that my contributions were making a meaningful difference in their quality of life. What I hadn't recognized was that Amanda's appreciation was focused on my utility rather than my personhood. She was grateful for the services I provided, but not necessarily for me as an individual with my own needs and limitations. The distinction had become clear when Michael's sleep problems resolved, and my intensive childcare assistance was no longer needed. Instead of the gratitude and consideration I'd expected after 6 months of significant sacrifice, I'd found that Amanda's expectations of my availability had actually increased rather than decreased. Because I'd demonstrated my willingness to provide intensive support during a crisis period, Amanda had concluded that this level of availability was my normal capacity, rather than an extraordinary effort that had required considerable personal sacrifice. When I'd attempted to gradually reduce my childcare involvement as Michael became more manageable, Amanda had responded with the kind of disappointment and frustration that suggested she'd come to see my assistance as an entitlement rather than a gift. "I thought you enjoyed spending time with the children," Amanda had said when I'd mentioned that I'd like to resume some of my pre-Michael activities, like my weekly volunteer work at the library and my book club meetings with friends from my old neighborhood. "I do enjoy spending time with Emma and Michael," I'd replied carefully. "But I also have other interests and commitments that I'd like to maintain." Amanda's expression had shifted in a way that I'd interpreted as disappointment, but that I now recognized had been irritation about the prospect of losing convenient access to free childcare. "Of course," she'd said, her tone carefully controlled. "I just thought you'd want to prioritize your relationship with your grandchildren while they're still young enough to benefit from your influence." The implication had been clear, that pursuing my own interests represented a failure to prioritize my family relationships appropriately. That wanting to maintain some independence and personal autonomy was somehow selfish or inappropriate for someone in my position. This pattern of reframing my normal human needs as character defects had become Amanda's primary strategy for maintaining control over my time and energy. Whenever I'd expressed interest in activities that didn't directly serve their family's needs, Amanda had found ways to suggest that my priorities were misplaced, or that my choices reflected poorly on my commitment to my role as grandmother. When I'd mentioned wanting to take a watercolor painting class at the senior center, Amanda had wondered aloud whether I really wanted to spend my limited time with strangers when I could be creating memories with Emma and Michael. When I'd expressed interest in traveling to visit my elderly cousin in Savannah, Amanda had raised concerns about whether it was safe for someone my age to travel alone, and whether the stress of travel might affect my heart condition. When I'd considered joining a bridge club that met weekly at the community center, Amanda had suggested that learning new activities at my age might be overwhelming, and that I might be more comfortable maintaining familiar routines. Each of these conversations had been presented as concern for my well-being rather than attempts to limit my independence, but the cumulative effect had been to gradually constrain my world until it revolved entirely around their household and their needs. The most devastating aspect of this systematic erosion of my autonomy had been how it had affected my relationship with David. Because Amanda's control strategies were subtle and were always framed as concern rather than manipulation, David had never recognized them as problematic behavior that required his intervention. Instead, David had gradually adopted Amanda's perspective that my desires for independence and personal autonomy were concerning symptoms of aging-related confusion rather than normal human needs that deserved respect and support. When I'd mentioned to David that I was feeling isolated and would like to reconnect with some of my old friends, he'd suggested that I was probably overthinking the situation and that I should focus on appreciating the family time I was fortunate enough to have. When I'd expressed frustration about Amanda's tendency to make assumptions about my availability, without consulting me first, David had gently suggested that I was being too sensitive, and that Amanda's casual approach to requesting help was evidence of how comfortable she'd become with me rather than a sign of disrespect. When I'd tried to discuss feeling taken for granted, David had responded with reassurances about how much the family valued me, but without any acknowledgement that their behavior might need to change rather than my expectations needing adjustment. The most painful realization had been that David's responses to my concerns consistently prioritized maintaining harmony with Amanda over addressing my legitimate needs for consideration and respect. Whenever there had been tension between Amanda's preferences and my well-being, David had invariably found ways to convince me to accommodate Amanda rather than asking Amanda to modify her behavior. This pattern had reached its most obvious expression during the incident with Emma's friend Hannah's birthday party, 8 months before the current crisis. Hannah's mother, Patricia Morrison, had organized an elaborate celebration at their country club, with professional entertainment, formal dining, and the kind of sophisticated atmosphere that made it an important social event for the parents as well as the children. When Emma had been invited, Amanda had immediately seen the party as an opportunity to network with other affluent parents and to strengthen the family's social connections within Riverside Estate's exclusive community. The invitation had included grandparents, and Emma had been excited about the prospect of having me attend her friend's special celebration. I'd been looking forward to the event as well, an opportunity to meet other families in Emma's social circle and to participate in the kind of formal gathering that I'd rarely had access to during my working years. But 3 days before the party, Amanda had approached me with concerns about my planned attendance. "Margaret, I've been thinking about Hannah's party," she'd said, her tone carrying the careful quality she used when she was about to make a request she knew would be unwelcome. "I'm wondering if it might be better if you didn't attend." I'd been genuinely confused by her suggestion. Why wouldn't I attend? Emma specifically asked me to come, and the invitation included grandparents. Amanda had shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling to find a way to express her concerns without revealing their true nature. "It's just that these events can be quite formal and the social dynamics among the parents can be quite complicated," she'd said finally. "I'm concerned that having to manage introductions and conversation topics while also supervising Emma might be overwhelming." Overwhelming for whom, I'd wondered, but hadn't asked. "I'm perfectly capable of managing social situations," I'd replied. "I've been attending formal events for longer than you've been alive." "Of course," Amanda had said quickly, "it's not about your capabilities. It's about the specific dynamics of this particular group. These are people David works with, potential business contacts, families whose social connections could affect our children's future opportunities. The conversations tend to focus on topics that might not align with your interests and experiences." My interests and experiences. Amanda was suggesting that my background made me unsuitable for socializing with the people she wanted to impress. "What exactly are you concerned about?" I'd asked, my patience beginning to wear thin. "Nothing specific," Amanda had said, her tone becoming defensive. "I just think it might be more comfortable for everyone if this particular event remained focused on the immediate family. There will be plenty of other opportunities for you to participate in Emma's social activities." But there hadn't been plenty of other opportunities. After the Hannah Morrison party exclusion, I'd noticed that my invitations to Emma and Michael's social events had become increasingly rare. Birthday parties, school performances, sports events, all the occasions where grandparents would normally be welcome and expected, had somehow become complicated by social dynamics that required my absence. When I'd finally brought this pattern to David's attention, his response had been predictably dismissive. "Mom, I think you're reading too much into these situations," he'd said. "Amanda's just trying to manage complex social dynamics. These business relationships are important for our family's future, and sometimes that requires making difficult choices about how to handle social events. Difficult choices that consistently involved my exclusion rather than efforts to include me in ways that addressed whatever concerns Amanda had about my social appropriateness." "David," I'd said, trying to help him understand the cumulative impact of these exclusions, "I'm being systematically removed from my grandchildren's important events. How is that acceptable?" "You're not being removed," David had replied. "You're being consulted about which events make the most sense for you to attend. There's a difference." But I wasn't being consulted. I was being informed about decisions that had already been made without my input. And the events that made sense for me to attend were increasingly limited to small, family-only gatherings that didn't involve the social networking opportunities that Amanda valued. The pattern had continued to escalate over the following months, with my participation in family activities becoming increasingly conditional on whether my presence aligned with Amanda's social and professional goals. Family dinners that included David's colleagues became adults, only events that required my absence. Social gatherings with other Riverside Estates families became complicated by my presence. Even routine activities like school pickup occasionally became inappropriate for me when Amanda was trying to make specific impressions on other parents. The most insulting aspect of this systematic exclusion had been Amanda's consistent presentation of these decisions as considerations for my comfort rather than acknowledgments of her own social anxieties. "I just thought you'd be more comfortable staying home today," she'd say when excluding me from events. "These group dynamics can be quite exhausting. I didn't want you to feel obligated to participate in something that might not be enjoyable for you," she'd explain when making plans that didn't include me. "I was trying to spare you the awkwardness of social situations that might not be the best fit," she'd rationalize when I questioned being left out of activities. The cumulative effect of these exclusions and explanations had been to gradually convince me that my social instincts were unreliable, that my desire for inclusion was inappropriate, and that my feelings of exclusion were evidence of my own oversensitivity, rather than legitimate responses to unfair treatment. Amanda had been remarkably effective at making me question my own perceptions and reactions. By consistently reframing my reasonable expectations as unreasonable demands, and by presenting her exclusions as kindnesses rather than slights, she'd managed to convince me that the problem was with my attitude rather than her behavior. This psychological manipulation had been so subtle and persistent that I'd genuinely begun to doubt my own judgment about social situations. When I felt hurt by being excluded from events, I'd wondered if I was being too sensitive. When I felt taken for granted, I'd questioned whether my expectations were too high. When I felt disrespected, I'd considered whether I was misinterpreting normal family dynamics. The erosion of my confidence and self-advocacy had made me increasingly vulnerable to additional exploitation. As I'd become less likely to assert my own needs and boundaries, Amanda had become more comfortable making assumptions about my availability and more casual about dismissing my preferences when they conflicted with her convenience. The process had been so gradual and so psychologically sophisticated that I hadn't recognized it as deliberate manipulation until this morning, when I'd overheard Amanda's conversation with David about strategic approaches to removing me from their home. Listening to Amanda describe her campaign to make me understand that it was time for me to reclaim my independence had finally provided the clarity I'd been missing about the systematic nature of my marginalization within their household. Amanda hadn't been responding to social awkwardness or managing complex family dynamics. She'd been implementing a long-term strategy to create conditions that would make my continued presence in their home untenable. The exclusions from social events hadn't been considerations for my comfort. They'd been demonstrations of my irrelevance to their social aspirations. The suggestions about senior communities and age-appropriate activities hadn't been expressions of concern for my well-being. They'd been preparations for the conversation Amanda was planning to initiate about my departure. The gradual reduction of appreciation and consideration hadn't been evidence of growing family comfort. It had been systematic devaluation designed to make me feel unwelcome in what I'd believed was my home. As I sat in my room that Wednesday morning, processing the implications of everything I'd learned and remembered, I felt a cold clarity settling over me that was different from anything I'd experienced since James had walked out of my life 31 years earlier. Both James and Amanda had used similar strategies: gradual erosion of respect, systematic undermining of my confidence, and strategic manipulation of family dynamics to achieve their desired outcomes. Both had been skilled at making their exploitation seem like my fault, their abandonment seem like my choice, their betrayal seem like my misunderstanding of the situation. But there was one crucial difference between my situation with James and my current situation with Amanda and David. When James had destroyed my life, I'd been a 26-year-old woman with limited resources, no established career, and a 4-year-old child who needed stability above all else. I'd been forced to accept whatever terms allowed me to survive and protect David's security. Now I was a 70-year-old woman with substantial financial resources, extensive life experience, and a comprehensive understanding of exactly how much power I actually possessed. Amanda and David were about to discover that the helpless burden they'd been planning to discard was actually someone who had the resources and determination to fight back in ways they'd never anticipated. They were about to learn that dismissing someone as irrelevant could be the biggest mistake they'd ever made. The conversation I was about to have with them would be the last conversation where they held the power to dictate terms. Tomorrow, the power dynamic in our family would be permanently reversed. The confrontation came at 6 p.m. that Wednesday evening, just as I'd expected it would after overhearing Amanda and David's morning conversation. I'd spent the day in my room, making phone calls and reviewing financial documents that I hadn't examined in months. By the time David knocked on my door, I was prepared for whatever approach they'd decided to take. "Mom, could you join Amanda? And me in the living room? We'd like to talk with you about something important." David's voice carried the careful, overly gentle tone he used when he was about to deliver news he expected me to find upsetting. It was the same tone he'd used when telling me about his divorce from his first wife, about his job changes, about any significant life development that might affect our relationship. I followed David to the main living room, where Amanda was seated on the leather sofa that had been purchased with money from my house sale. She looked composed but nervous, like someone who'd rehearsed a difficult speech, but wasn't entirely confident about how it would be received. "Please sit down," David said, gesturing toward the chair across from where he and Amanda sat together. The physical positioning was clearly intentional. The two of them united on one side, me isolated on the other, the arrangement designed to emphasize that they were a team, and I was the subject of their intervention. "What did you want to discuss?" I asked, settling into the chair and watching their faces carefully. David glanced at Amanda, who nodded slightly, apparently giving him permission to begin the conversation they'd planned. "Mom, Amanda and I have been talking about your living situation here," David began, his voice carrying forced casualness, "and we're wondering if it might be time to consider some alternatives that would give you more independence and social opportunities." More independence. David was framing my removal from their home as an opportunity for greater freedom rather than acknowledging it as abandonment. "What kind of alternatives?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Amanda leaned forward, her expression taking on the bright, encouraging look she used when trying to sell someone on an idea they weren't going to like. "We've been researching some lovely senior communities in the Charleston area," she said, pulling out a folder of glossy brochures that she'd obviously prepared in advance. "Places designed specifically for active adults who want to maintain their independence while having access to social activities and support services." She spread the brochures across the coffee table like a travel agent presenting vacation options. Magnolia Gardens Senior Living, Charleston Oaks Retirement Community, Riverside Manor Active Adult Village. Each brochure featured photographs of smiling elderly people engaged in activities that were supposed to look fulfilling and engaging. "These communities offer so much more than we can provide here," Amanda continued, her enthusiasm seeming forced rather than genuine. "Organized social activities, fitness programs, educational opportunities, transportation services. You'd have your own apartment, but with access to dining services, housekeeping, and healthcare support when you need it. Your own apartment." Amanda was describing these facilities as if living alone in institutional housing was preferable to being part of a family. "And financially?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. David shifted uncomfortably, clearly the part of this conversation he'd been dreading. "Well, these communities do require entrance fees and monthly expenses," he admitted. "But with the money you have in savings, plus Social Security, it should be manageable. And if you needed additional support, we'd certainly help however we could." Help however they could. David was suggesting that I would be financially responsible for my own displacement while they continued to benefit from the money I'd already contributed to their lifestyle. "I see," I said, picking up one of the brochures and examining it carefully. "And you think I'd be happier in one of these places than I am here, living with my family?" Amanda and David exchanged another glance, and I could see Amanda giving David an encouraging nod. "Mom, the thing is," David said, his voice becoming more direct, "Amanda and I feel like we're not really able to give you the kind of attention and social engagement that someone your age needs. We're so busy with work and the children's activities that we worry you're not getting the companionship and stimulation that would make you truly happy." Not getting the companionship and stimulation. David was suggesting that my isolation was due to their neglect rather than their deliberate exclusion of me from family activities. "Besides," Amanda added, her voice taking on a slightly sharper edge, "Emma and Michael are getting older and need more independence. Having multiple generations in one household can sometimes make it difficult for children to develop appropriate self-reliance and social skills." There it was. The suggestion that my presence was somehow harmful to my grandchildren's development, that my love and involvement in their lives was a liability rather than an asset. "What do Emma and Michael think about this idea?" I asked, another uncomfortable glance between Amanda and David. "We haven't discussed it with them yet," Amanda said carefully. "We wanted to talk with you first, obviously, but children are remarkably adaptable, and they'd certainly be excited about visiting you in your new home and participating in all the activities these communities offer." Visiting me. Amanda was reducing my relationship with my grandchildren from daily presence to scheduled visits, as if that transition would be equivalent or even beneficial. I set down the brochure I'd been holding and looked directly at both of them. "Let me make sure I understand what you're proposing," I said, my voice remaining calm despite the anger building in my chest. "You want me to move out of this house, which I helped you purchase with money from the sale of my own home. You want me to pay for my own housing in an institutional facility where I'll be isolated from my grandchildren except for occasional visits. And you're presenting this as an opportunity for greater independence and happiness." "Mom, that's not how we'd characterize it," David said quickly. "Then how would you characterize it?" I asked. David struggled for words, clearly not having anticipated that I would require him to explicitly acknowledge what they were actually asking me to do. We're suggesting that it might be time for you to explore living arrangements that are specifically designed for your needs and interests, he said finally. My needs and interests, I repeated. And you've determined that my needs and interests don't include being part of my son's family or having a daily relationship with my grandchildren. That's not what we're saying, Amanda interjected, her composure beginning to crack slightly. We're saying that there are living situations that might be more appropriate for someone your age, situations that would give you access to peer companionship and activities designed for your generation. More appropriate, I said. Because living with family is inappropriate for someone my age. Margaret, you're twisting our words, Amanda said, her voice taking on the frustrated tone she used when she felt her reasonable explanations weren't being properly appreciated. Am I? I asked. Because what I'm hearing is that after 2 years of living in this house, contributing to this household, caring for these children, and helping to make your comfortable lifestyle possible, you've decided that my presence is no longer convenient for you. It's not about convenience, David said, his voice becoming defensive. It's about what's best for everyone involved. And you've determined that what's best for everyone involved is for me to leave. We've determined that what's best is for you to have the kind of independent, fulfilling life that these communities can provide, Amanda said, her patience clearly wearing thin. I stood up from my chair, looking down at both of them sitting together on the sofa I'd helped them buy. Let me ask you one simple question, I said. Do you want me to continue living in this house? The silence that followed was more devastating than any words could have been. For nearly 30 seconds, neither David nor Amanda responded to my direct question, both of them clearly struggling to find a way to say no without explicitly acknowledging the cruelty of their position. Finally, David spoke, his voice small and reluctant. Mom, we think it would be better for everyone if you explored other options. Better for everyone. David couldn't even bring himself to admit that he wanted his mother out of his home. I see, I said, my voice remaining eerily calm. In that case, let me make this very simple for you. No. No? Amanda asked, her confusion genuine. No, I will not be moving to a senior community. No, I will not be paying for my own displacement. No, I will not be pretending that this conversation was about my well-being rather than your convenience. David stood up, his expression shifting from nervousness to frustration. Mom, you're not being reasonable, he said. We're offering to help. You find a place where you'll be happy and independent. We're not throwing you out on the street. You're offering to help me find a place where I'll be out of your way, I corrected. There's a difference. Margaret, Amanda said, her voice taking on the steely quality I'd heard that morning when she'd discussed making the situation uncomfortable for everyone involved. I think you need to consider the reality of this situation. You're 70 years old, living in someone else's home, dependent on someone else's generosity. This is not a sustainable long-term arrangement, and pretending otherwise is not helpful for anyone. Someone else's home. Someone else's generosity. Amanda was rewriting the history of my financial contribution, and 2 years of domestic service to position me as a charity case, rather than a family member who'd been contributing to their household. You're absolutely right, Amanda, I said, my voice taking on a tone that made both of them look at me more carefully. This is not a sustainable long-term arrangement, and it's time for some changes. I walked over to the coffee table and gathered up the senior community brochures, stacking them neatly before handing them back to Amanda. But the changes that need to happen aren't the ones you're suggesting, I continued. The changes that need to happen are going to surprise you both considerably. David's expression shifted from frustration to confusion. What do you mean? I mean that you've both made a serious miscalculation about the power dynamics in this relationship, I said, returning to my chair and settling in as if I was about to deliver a lecture. You seem to think that I'm dependent on your tolerance and generosity. You seem to believe that I have no alternatives except to accept whatever terms you choose to offer. You seem to imagine that I'm powerless to respond when you decide my presence is inconvenient. Mom, what are you talking about? David asked, his voice carrying a note of alarm. I'm talking about the fact that you've forgotten who actually has the power in this situation, I said. Let me refresh your memory. I reached into the folder I'd brought with me from my room and pulled out a stack of financial documents I'd been reviewing all day. This house, I said, pulling out the mortgage paperwork, has a current market value of approximately $850,000. Your outstanding mortgage balance is $520,000. Your monthly payment is $3,200, and your current loan has a balloon payment of the E-ship full remaining balance due in 14 months. David's face had gone pale. How do you know the details of our mortgage? Because I helped you qualify for this mortgage with my financial contribution, I said. Because I'm listed as a co-signer on your loan documents. Because when you were having trouble qualifying for the amount you wanted to borrow, you asked me to guarantee your loan with my own assets and creditworthiness. Amanda was staring at me with growing alarm. What are you getting at? I'm getting at the fact that your balloon mortgage payment of $520,000 is due 14 months from now, I said. And in the current economic climate with David's company, downsizing and Amanda's consulting business providing irregular income, you're going to have considerable difficulty qualifying for refinancing. I pulled out another document. David, your current annual salary is $95,000, down from $110,000 last year due to the company restructuring. Amanda, your consulting business grossed $31,000 last year, but your net income after expenses was only $18,000. Your combined annual income of $113,000 is insufficient to qualify for refinancing on a $520,000 loan, especially given your current debt-to-income ratio. How do you know all of this? David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Because I've spent the day making phone calls, I said. To your mortgage company, to David's human resources department, to Amanda's accountant. It's amazing how much information people will share with a co-signer who's concerned about the loan status. I pulled out a third document. But here's the most interesting thing I learned today. Your mortgage company has been considering selling your loan to private investors because balloon mortgages have become liability concerns for traditional lenders. They'd be very interested in transferring the risk to a private party with excellent credit and substantial assets. Amanda's face had gone completely white. Margaret, what are you saying? I'm saying that I've submitted a bid to purchase your mortgage, I said calmly. And given my creditworthiness and the size of my cash offer, the mortgage company has indicated they're very likely to accept my proposal. The silence that followed was absolute. Both David and Amanda were staring at me with expressions of shock and growing horror as they began to understand the implications of what I was telling them. You're going to own our mortgage? David asked, his voice cracking slightly. As of tomorrow morning, I will most likely be your mortgage holder, I confirmed. Which means that your monthly payments will come to me. Your balloon payment will be due to me. And your application for refinancing will be subject to my approval. You can't do this, Amanda said, her voice rising with panic. Actually, I can, I replied. It's a completely legal transaction. I have the financial resources, the creditworthiness, and the legal right as a co-signer to protect my investment in this property. I pulled out another folder, this one containing documents I'd prepared during my afternoon phone calls. But purchasing your mortgage is just the beginning, I continued. I've also been in contact with David's employer about some irregularities in his expense reporting during his recent business trips. Apparently, there are questions about certain charges that may not comply with company policy. David's face turned ashen. What irregularities? The $200 dinner charge at that exclusive restaurant in Atlanta, claimed as a client entertainment expense when no clients were actually present. The luxury hotel suite upgrade charged to the company when standard accommodations were approved. The car service charges that exceeded approved transportation allowances. Those were legitimate business expenses, David protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Perhaps, I said, but they'll require extensive documentation and investigation, which could affect David's standing with the company and his eligibility for future promotion or salary increases. I turned to Amanda. And then there's the matter of your consulting. Business, Amanda. I've been in touch with the Charleston Chamber of Commerce about some concerns regarding your business practices. What concerns? Amanda asked, her voice barely audible. Well, it seems there are questions about whether you've been representing your qualifications accurately to potential clients. Your business website claims you have an advanced degree in organizational psychology, but my research indicates you have a bachelor's degree in general psychology with no additional certifications. Amanda's composure finally cracked completely. That's a minor discrepancy in marketing language, she said desperately. Perhaps, I replied, but it's the kind of discrepancy that can seriously damage a consultant's reputation and credibility in a small business community like Charleston. I stood up again, looking down at both of them as they sat frozen on their sofa. So here's the new arrangement, I said, my voice taking on the authoritative tone I'd perfected during my decades of managing household and financial crises. I will be remaining in this house indefinitely. You will continue to make your mortgage, payments to me on time every month. When your balloon payment comes due, you will submit a refinancing application that I will review based on your payment history and our family relationship. Margaret, you can't force us to live with you, Amanda said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. You're absolutely right, I agreed. I can't force you to live anywhere. If you find my presence in this house uncomfortable, you're welcome to find alternative housing. But this house will remain my primary residence for as long as I choose to stay here. This is blackmail, David said, his voice shaking with anger and fear. This is consequences, I corrected. You wanted to discuss my living situation, and now we've discussed it. You wanted to talk about what's best for everyone involved, and I've explained what the new arrangement will be. I gathered up my documents and prepared to return to my room. The mortgage purchase should be finalized by tomorrow afternoon, I said. Your first payment to me will be due on the 1st of next month. I'll expect it to be on time and accompanied by a detailed accounting of how you plan to improve your financial position before the balloon payment comes due. I paused at the entrance to the living room and looked back at them. Oh, and Amanda? About Emma's birthday party this weekend. I'll be attending, of course. I'm looking forward to meeting all of your sophisticated friends and colleagues. I'm sure we'll have many interesting topics to discuss. As I walked back to my room, I could hear Amanda beginning to cry, and David trying to comfort her while they both processed the complete reversal of power that had just occurred. 3 hours later, there was a soft knock on my door. I opened it, to find Emma and Michael standing in the hallway, both looking confused and concerned. Grandma Margaret? Emma said, her 8-year-old voice small and worried. Mom is crying, and Dad looks really upset. Are you going away? I knelt down to Emma's level and took both children's hands in mine. No, sweetheart, I said gently. I'm not going anywhere. Grandma Margaret is going to be staying right here with you for as long as you want me to. Forever? Michael asked, his 10-year-old bravado not quite hiding his relief. For as long as you need me, I promised. Good, Emma said, throwing her arms around my neck. I don't want you to live somewhere else. I want you to stay here and help me with my homework and read me stories and be my grandma. That's exactly what I'm going to do, I assured her. After tucking both children into bed and assuring them that everything was going to be fine, I returned to my room and made one final phone call. Helen? I said when my old friend answered. It's Margaret. I wanted to let you know that everything worked out exactly as we planned. Did they try to force you to move to a senior facility? Helen asked. They tried, I said. But I don't think they'll be making that suggestion again anytime soon. And the mortgage purchase went through? It will be finalized tomorrow. By the end of the week, I'll be their landlord instead of their charity case. Helen laughed. Margaret, you are absolutely brilliant. Those two had no idea what they were dealing with. No, I agreed. They didn't. But they're learning. 6 months later, I was sitting in the same living room where David and Amanda had tried to convince me to move to a senior community, watching Emma practice for her spring piano recital while Michael worked on a school project at the dining room table. The house felt different now, warmer, more peaceful, more like an actual home rather than a showcase for Amanda's social aspirations. David and Amanda were different too, more respectful, more considerate, more aware that their comfort and security depended on maintaining a positive relationship with someone they'd previously taken for granted. The mortgage payments arrived, on time every month, accompanied by handwritten notes updating me on their efforts to improve their financial situation and expressing gratitude for my patience and understanding. David had received a promotion at work, partly because he'd become more careful about expense reporting and more focused on legitimate professional development. Amanda had enrolled in courses to earn the certifications her website had claimed she already possessed, and her consulting business was slowly rebuilding its reputation based on actual qualifications rather than exaggerated credentials. Most importantly, I was included in every family decision, consulted about every major purchase, and invited to every social event. Emma's birthday party had been a remarkable success, with Amanda proudly introducing me to her friends as David's mother, who helped make our beautiful home possible, rather than attempting to hide my presence or minimize my significance. 3 senior community brochures had been quietly discarded, never to be mentioned again. On this particular evening, as I watched my grandchildren flourish in the stable, loving environment I'd fought to preserve, David approached me with an expression of genuine remorse. Mom, he said, settling into the chair across from me, I owe you an apology. Oh? I said, looking up from the book I'd been reading. I was wrong to consider asking you to leave, he said, his voice carrying the weight of 6 months of reflection. This is your home, and we should never have made you feel unwelcome here. What changed your mind? I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective on our family transformation. Watching you with Emma and Michael, he said. Seeing how much happier and more secure they are with you here. Realizing how much I'd missed having you as part of my daily life. Understanding that what Amanda and I thought was independence was actually just isolation. He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. I think I forgot, somewhere along the way, that you're not just my mother. You're also Emma and Michael's grandmother, and their relationship with you is separate from whatever adult complications Amanda and I created. I had no right to interfere with that relationship for our convenience. And Amanda, I asked, how does she feel about the current arrangement? David smiled slightly. Amanda has discovered that having you here is actually an asset rather than a liability. Her friends are impressed by our multi-generational household, and several of them have asked for advice about caring for their own aging parents. Apparently, families that successfully integrate multiple generations are seen as sophisticated rather than traditional. Imagine that, I said dryly. Mom, David said, his voice becoming more serious. I want you to know that I'm grateful every day that you didn't let us make the biggest mistake of our lives. I don't know what I was thinking, trying to push away the person who'd sacrificed everything to give me opportunities. You were thinking about what seemed easiest in the short term, I replied. But families aren't built on what's easiest. They're built on what's right. I love you, Mom, David said, leaning over to kiss my forehead. And I'm sorry it took almost losing you to remember how much I need you in my life. That night, as I prepared for bed in the room I'd fought to keep, I reflected on how completely the power dynamics in our family had changed, 6 months ago, I'd been the expendable grandmother who could be discarded when convenient. Now I was the matriarch whose approval and cooperation were essential for everyone's security and happiness. David. And Amanda had learned that dismissing someone as powerless could be the most dangerous miscalculation they'd ever made. They'd discovered that the woman they'd seen as a burden was actually the foundation that held their entire lifestyle together. Most importantly, they'd realized that respect isn't optional in family relationships. It's the price of admission. As I turned off the lights and settled into my bed, I smiled thinking about Amanda's comment that morning at breakfast. "Margaret," she'd said, "I've been thinking about adding a sunroom to the house. Would you like to help me design it? I'd love to have your input on making it a space where you'd be comfortable spending time. A sunroom designed around my preferences, in the house where I'd once been told there wasn't room for me." The transformation was complete. Sometimes the people who try to throw you away discover they actually threw away the most valuable thing they had. Sometimes the family members who treat you as disposable learn too late that you were actually indispensable. And sometimes, when you're finally forced to fight for the respect you deserve, you discover you had the power to demand it all along. You just needed the right motivation to use it. If someone in your life is treating you like you're disposable, maybe it's time to show them exactly how much they need what they're trying to throw away. Maybe it's time to stop accepting crumbs and start demanding the feast you've earned. Because respect isn't a gift that others give you. It's a requirement that you enforce. And sometimes the best thing that can happen is when someone pushes you far enough that you finally decide to push back. What's your story? Share it in the comments below. And remember to like and subscribe for more stories about turning your worst moment into your greatest victory. You're never too old, never too weak, never too powerless to rewrite the terms of how people treat you. Sometimes you just need to remind them exactly who they're dealing with. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.